Hi, my name's Neil and welcome to a video which a few people have asked me to make now, and that is how have I found the transition from Nikon DSLR cameras to Sony mirrorless when it comes to wedding photography. So about 3 months ago I purchased my Sony A9 mirrorless camera. That's the first mirrorless camera I've ever bought, and in that time I photographed around 10 weddings, so I feel as though I'm in quite a good position now to give you my thoughts on the camera, what I've liked and what I've struggled with, and to give you a really rounded view of how I found that transition. This isn't going to be a technical review as such. I'm not going to go into lots of detail about the camera settings and the menus, which are vast. It's going to be a talk through about my real world experience of how I found using the camera as a wedding photographer. I found there to be 3 huge advantages, and they are huge advantages to using the A9, but they've also been things which I've struggled with as well a little bit. So that's what I'm going to be talking through in this video, the 3 biggest upsides and the 3 downsides to the transition to Sony cameras. One thing to note is that this video has lots of images in it. I'm going to start off with a slideshow, and then I use lots of images to illustrate certain points about the camera, but the main thing to note is that every image which you see in this video has been taken on the A9 in the 3 months since I've owned the camera. Even the camera which I'm using to film this video is the A9. So I hope that that will give you a really good idea about the image quality of the camera. The other thing just to note is that I filmed this video over 2 days. The first day it was raining, so if halfway through you notice that my hair seems a bit wetter than it does now, that's the reason why. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Let's crack on. So a good place to start is probably a little bit of background. I've been photographing weddings now since 2006, so that's 12 years. And since my very first wedding, I've only ever owned Nikon DSLRs. I started with the Nikon D70, went to the Nikon D300 from there, and then the Nikon D700, and now the D800, and now the D810, which is where I'm up to. So I've only ever used Nikon, and I've never had any issue with them whatsoever. I've always really loved using Nikon cameras and never had any problems with them. So I wasn't exactly looking to change as such. I was just curious more so than anything else about what these mirrorless cameras were all about and why so many people seem to be enjoying using them. But what happened was I photographed a wedding with a good friend of mine, David Stubbs, who had moved to Sony, I think around a year previous to me shooting this wedding with him. And I'd mentioned to him a few times that I was interested in playing with a Sony camera. He had a Sony A9, which is one that I know I was interested in. So shooting this wedding together, he gave me the camera for a few minutes just to have a play with it, and it honestly, I would say within 2 or 3 minutes of holding the camera and using it for the first time, I knew I was going to change. It was that much of a difference. One particular thing which happened within that time frame when I was using that camera is I went outside. So this was a big wedding we were photographing with probably about 200 guests, and all the guests were in the marquee, and I just happened to walk outside and saw this really lovely scene where an elderly couple were dancing on their own in the grounds of the venue, and I thought, oh, that looks really nice. As I went closer, I thought, I've only really got one shot to get this, because as soon as they hear the click of the shutter, they're going to be camera aware, and as soon as they become camera aware, then my cover as a photographer is blown, if you like. Now that would have been the case, but because I was using the A9, which was completely silent, I was able to take a shot and then another and another. And because I was silent, I could be completely inconspicuous and they had no idea I was taking those photographs. And at that point, I realized I have to go this way with my photography because it became obvious to me that just that one thing alone, if I was shooting with the sound of my shutter going off, that would have blown my cover, as I say, and they probably would have been camera aware instantly, and I would have not been able to get that scene and capture that moment for them. So it was a very quick realization that this has to be the way that I go, because I'm actually, if I stay on DSLRs, already within a couple of minutes I realized that I was probably going to be at a disadvantage. So that was the moment I really thought, yeah, I need to really look into moving. It was literally that quick. And this is one of the things that I'm going to stress a bit in this video, that a lot of things that I'm going to talk about, there are three huge advantages which I found from going from my Nikon D810s to the Sony A9 camera. And these three advantages, you only really realize how big they are when you've tried them yourself. It's very difficult to sometimes get across just how powerful these changes can be and how much they have changed my photography. So that's a little bit of background to me and why I made the move. So I'm going to talk you through now the three biggest differences, the three biggest advantages, if you like, that I found since using my Sony A9 compared to my Nikon D810 DSLRs and how they've impacted my photography. So the first thing I would talk about, and probably what I found to be the biggest single advantage of using my Sony A9 camera for wedding photography, is the ability to shoot silently. That has been massive for me. I am, for the 90% of a wedding day, a documentary wedding photographer. I don't want to impact on the wedding day at all. I want that day to run as if it would do if I wasn't even there. Now, to do that, I really rely on people to not be camera aware. As soon as they become aware of me being there, and they are camera aware, then I feel as though my cover is blown and the images don't really have the same impact as if the bride and groom were completely oblivious to me. So my whole way of working is based around trying to be unobtrusive, trying to document the day, as I say, as if I wasn't even there. It's very, very important to me that my pictures have authenticity and that they're real, and that the people within the frame are not camera aware. That's massive to me. I never like any shot where people are looking into the camera, because that takes away the feeling, in my opinion, of that shot being unobtrusive and natural. Now, another facet of the way that I shoot weddings in a documentary way is I like to be physically close to people. The closer I am, the better the images I feel become. I feel as though the images that I take when I'm physically closer have a much more natural feel, and you feel as a viewer as though you're part of that image. So because I like to be close, I have to really concentrate on being unobtrusive in the way that I manage myself to be able to become invisible when I'm physically close. Now, the biggest advantage that I found, as I say, with the Sony A9 camera compared to my Nikon DSLRs with this, is that when I'm silent, it obviously becomes even easier for me to become invisible. Because even if I'm trying my absolute best to be unobtrusive, the moment I press a shutter and it makes a sound, even on the quiet shutter mode, it still is quite a loud sound relative to silence. And I've become very, very aware of that now. One thing I should just mention at the moment is that I only actually own one Sony body at the moment, which is the A9, which I'm filming this video on. So at the moment, when it comes to weddings, I'm shooting with two cameras, my Sony camera on this side and my Nikon camera on this side. So I'm still using the two systems. But what becomes really apparent when I am using those two systems is just the difference in how loud a shutter becomes when you're used to shooting silently. When you have shot with a completely silent shutter and a completely silent camera, going back to using a camera with a shutter, a mechanical shutter, seems deafening. The A9 enables me to shoot silently without any banding issues, and that's a huge advantage. That's the reason why the A9 is more expensive. I think that's the biggest reason, as far as to my knowledge. that you don't suffer any banding issues regardless of the lighting conditions. So I think with the A7 III, you can shoot silently, but if you're indoors in artificial light, you get banding across the frame, which basically means that it can't be used in many situations, which for a wedding photographer makes it, in my opinion, makes that silent mode almost redundant, because if you're in a church with fluorescent lighting, artificial lighting, you're not going to be able to shoot silently without getting the banding issue, unless you shoot at very slow shutter speeds, and I don't want to compromise. I don't see the point in compromising when for a few £100 more, I can shoot silently and not have to worry about the banding issue. So shooting silently has been huge. I can't stress enough how much better it is to shoot completely silently when you're trying to photograph weddings in a documentary fashion. It is literally game changing, and I could never go back now to wanting to shoot purely DSLRs. They feel just antiquated and loud and clunky, and the difference, as I said before, until you try this, until you shoot silently, you can't really comprehend the difference. I wouldn't have thought that the difference would be as great as I have found it. In particular, on a wedding day, if there's any moments which are quite emotional, and obviously with it being a wedding day, you know, that's what wedding days are all about, capturing the emotion. But there are certain times with a DSLR where that shutter seems incredibly loud. Say, for example, during speeches, there can be hugely emotional moments during speeches where, especially if someone is maybe talking about one of their relatives or a family member who isn't with us anymore, then, you know, these are really impactful moments that I feel it's important to capture, but you don't want to impede on that moment either. The last thing I ever want to do as a photographer is kill a moment and become obtrusive. It should never be about me. But when these moments come, you're aware of the silence, pressing that shutter and hearing that click becomes really loud. Now, if you're shooting silently, you don't have to worry about that at all. And that's one moment which I've found has been really freeing. And I've loved the experience of not having to worry about that anymore. And I feel I can capture emotion much better for that. And another example of that, a very key one on a wedding day, is shooting in a church, where sometimes we're asked not to take pictures at all, or if we can, then to be as unobtrusive as possible. So again, shooting silently is such an advantage, because it enables me to feel as though I can get a little bit closer. I can take more pictures because I don't have to be as mindful of the shutter. It is allowing me to take photographs which I would not have been able to take because of restrictions that would have been put on me by the church. It's been huge. The photograph you see on the screen now, I feel as though I probably wouldn't have been able to take as well. I probably would have been further away for these moments, but because I can shoot silently, I can get closer, and hardly anyone is aware of me even being there. So yeah, shooting silently has been game changing, and that's been a huge thing for me, and I've loved the experience of shooting silently. So number one, definitely in terms of advantages, shooting silently, it's been massive. Okay, so the second thing which I've found to be a huge advantage of moving to Sony has been the use of the EVF, which is the electronic viewfinder. So with the DSLR, when we look through the viewfinder, what we're looking at is a real-world interpretation of the light coming in through the lens, hitting a mirror, and that's what's then we're taking in with our eye. So there is no electronics between what the camera is bringing in and what we're seeing with our own eye. So when we change our camera settings, nothing changes within the actual viewfinder. Now that's completely different with a mirrorless camera, because what we're looking at there is an electronic interpretation of what the camera is seeing. In real world terms, what that means is that when we change our camera settings, what we're seeing through the viewfinder, through the EVF, changes in real time as well. And that is a massive advantage. So for example, if we look through the viewfinder and we change our shutter speed, say we shoot at a slower shutter speed, what we see through the viewfinder is going to change live as we change the shutter speed. What that means is that when we are shooting live, especially in challenging light conditions, that we can make the changes, and because we're seeing live what we're taking, there isn't the same need to chimp. Well, there isn't any need to chimp, and by chimp what I mean is taking a picture. This is how I used to work: taking a picture, look at the back of the camera, change your exposure to suit, taking another picture, yep, nearly there now. And that little process of taking 2 or 3 little test shots, if you like, inevitably slows you down as a photographer. Now, there's no need to do that with an EVF because you're seeing the changes live, and that goes for aperture as well. So if we change our aperture, the depth of field is changing literally as we're looking through the viewfinder. And again, until you've tried this, you can't really comprehend just how big an advantage that is. It enables you as a photographer to shoot faster and to know that what you're taking is correct exposure-wise. So there's no need to keep a look at the back of the camera now at all, and that enables you to work faster and, more importantly, to be really reactive. So if you used to see anything and you think, oh, it's in a different lighting condition, you instantly can see that and you can instantly change your settings to suit. So you can get to the point that where you want to be exposure-wise almost immediately, and I found that to be a massive advantage. There is literally no need now to keep a look at the back of my camera. Even when reviewing images on a DSLR, if I wanted to review my image, I would have to look down at the back of the camera screen. Again, these are things that I didn't realize were such of an issue, but now I don't even need to move my eye away from the viewfinder, because if I just press review on the back of the camera, I see what I've just taken in the viewfinder. So I don't have to take my eye away, and the more that I can keep my eye up to the viewfinder, the better I can be at anticipating and capturing moments. And I feel as though that's been a massive advantage. As I say, I'm currently shooting weddings with 2 cameras, the Sony and the Nikon, and the difference between shooting on the Sony and the experience of using the EVF compared to using my Nikon and having to look at the back of the screen, take another shot, look at the back of the screen, you just realise just what a difference that is and how antiquated the DSLR system feels. Documentary wedding photography, it's all about being reactive to moments, and even the process of just taking a picture, looking at the screen, taking another picture, and then shooting again, gives you the potential of missing out on moments that are so fleeting and so fragile, and once the moment is gone, it's gone. So the EVF again has been a massive advantage, and again something that I couldn't now go back to not using. So again, advantage number 2, the EVF. Okay, just before I go on to the third point, I just need to apologise for the state of my hair. I always like coming outside to film these. I just feel like it's a bit easier for me. I like to stand up. I'm not very good at talking when I'm sat down. I need to move, but I've come out and the heavens have just opened. So I look a bit of a mess, so apologies for that, but hopefully that won't affect the content in any way. So now I'm going to move on to the third point, which I've found to be a huge advantage of the Sony cameras, and that has been the autofocus. The autofocus on the A9, and I'm sure other mirrorless cameras, but the autofocus that I can only talk about on the A9 has been ridiculously good. Like, it is freakish to me how reliable and how good that autofocus is, and it's been absolutely game-changing for me. So again, it's only in real-world practice that I have realized how with my Nikon cameras I was probably overshooting in order to ensure that I was getting focus correct. So for example, if I was taking a portrait of a couple, I would tend to take 3 or 4 shots of that same scene, just changing my focus each time just to ensure that I had shots in focus. I would have to just make sure by just overshooting that little bit. With the Sony cameras, even though I've only been using the A9, as I say, for about 10 weddings, about 3 months, I have absolute faith that if I would take 1 shot, it would be bang in focus. And that is such a good feeling when you're a wedding photographer and you know that focus is beyond important. I can absolutely trust it to nail the focus every time, and it's an amazing feeling. The other thing is, I used to, with my DSLR, I would what's called focus and recompose. So I would use the middle focus point, I'd lock my focus, and then I'd move the camera slightly to compose the scene, because I found that the focus was much better that way. It was also because I didn't really feel as though I could trust the outer focus points on my D810. If I did, I think that the reliability of it being in focus dropped the further away I went from the center focus point. Now that is just completely turned on its head with the A9, because I can use any focus point and it's going to be sharp, and not just any. If I use the furthest corner focus point on the A9, even if I'm shooting at say 1.8 or 1.4 on my 35mm lens, the focus is not just sharp, it is tack sharp, freakishly sharp. And that is, when I first started taking test shots, I'm thinking, that can't be right. I take another one. Wow, it is insane how good it is. And I say I didn't really even think I had that much of an issue with focus with my DSLRs. It's just the fact that this is so much better that it makes the DSLR just feel like an unreliable, clunky old machine. It really is that big a difference. And again, like, I didn't really anticipate this to be the case, but the difference has been huge. And just building on from the autofocus, one of the main reasons I wanted to move to Sony especially, and the A9, was because of autofocus. Now, if you're not aware of what this is, it is game changing. And what it basically does is there is a button that you can customize the buttons however you want with the Sony camera, but there is a button which I have dedicated to what's called autofocus. And what that means, if I press that button, the focus will lock onto the eye of the subject that I'm shooting, the closest eye to the camera. And if I keep my finger on that button, it keeps the focus locked onto that eye, regardless of where they move and how far away or near to the camera they are. And that, again, is absolutely game changing. It's insane. If you're shooting a bride walking down the aisle, then obviously that is a hugely important part of the day, and you cannot afford to mess that up. You have to nail your focus when the bride's walking down the aisle. And my concentration would be all on the focus of getting the bride in focus. Now with the Sony, with the A9, as soon as I see the bride walking down the aisle, I can lock the eye, I can lock the focus onto her eye, keep my finger on that focus button, on the eye focus button, and it's locked on then. So if she's walking towards me, I know that she's in focus continuously. So what that means is I don't have to worry anymore about the focus to anywhere near the same degree, because the camera is doing the work for me. What that then allows me to do is concentrate more on getting my composition right, and that in itself has really improved the images that I'm taking. And that's just one example of something that we come across on every single wedding day. Autofocus is just revolutionary, because as soon as you lock your focus onto that eye, you then can start to, your concentration then looks at the composition more. You don't realise just how big a difference that is until you've experienced it, until you've tried it. Autofocus, and autofocus in particular, has been insanely good, and I've loved using the Sony cameras for that. It's really nice knowing I can have complete 100% trust that the focus is going to be nailed, because there have been times in the past where I've took a shot and I've been really like, oh, I really like that shot, really can't wait to look at that, I feel as though I caught a moment well, and you realise that your focus is not quite bang on when you look at it on the computer, and that's really demoralizing and it's really sort of like frustrating. It's not been the case with the Sony at all, and it's been amazing having that trust in the camera. So yeah, autofocus, again, massive advantage. Okay, so they're the three main things, the biggest things that I found to be advantages in my move to Sony. So the silent shooting, the EVF, and the autofocus. They've been the three huge advantages that I've found. But there are smaller advantages as well that maybe aren't quite as big a deal, but adding to the experience of shooting, which I've found to be good things. So I'm not going to dwell on them very much, but one of those has been the flippy screen. So the Sony A9 has a screen which comes out at the back, which you can tilt. Now that means that rather than having to, as I would do in the past, lie on the floor in certain situations, if I wanted like to be getting maybe a reflection in a puddle, I'd be lying on the floor, so I'm getting wet, dirty. Don't have to do that anymore. I can just tilt the screen and put the camera as close to the floor as I want, and I can shoot that way. So again, a big advantage. And also during the ceremony, as you're going to see with a couple of pictures on the screen now, I've been able to lift the camera high up above my head, tilt the screen and shoot down onto the scene, and it's allowed me to shoot compositions which I wouldn't have been able to take, or I could have tried to tilt, but it would have been very risky to take with the DSLR. So again, not a huge huge deal for me, the flippy screen, but it's something that I've really enjoyed using, and it's definitely worth noting. And the other thing is just the size of the camera. Mirrorless cameras, especially the A9 compared to my D810, is a physically smaller and lighter camera. Now that's not anything that I was particularly bothered about. The weight was never so much a big issue for me, but you know, given the choice, it's nicer to have a lighter camera and a smaller camera on you than a bigger camera. So that's been a nice thing. One thing just to note though, the weight difference that I found in the bodies and the size difference has been negated a little bit by the actual lenses. So with my Nikon DSLRs, I was mainly shooting with a 35mm 1.8 lens and an 85mm 1.8 lens. The reason I used those lenses was that they were very small and very light. Now the lenses that I'm using with the A9, the 35 and the 85, are both heavier and physically a bit bigger. So the size difference that I've gained in the actual camera body, I'm almost losing with the lenses. I could change my lenses to compensate, but I say it's not been a huge issue for me. But yeah, so that's just worth pointing that although the body size is smaller, the lenses themselves I've found, or my lenses that I bought for the Sony have been a little bit bigger, so that sort of evened itself out a little bit. So moving to Sony hasn't been perfect. There have been downsides, and I'm going to talk about those now. I found there to be 3 downsides in particular, and the first one is using off-camera flash. Now, I love using off-camera flash, not just for bride and groom portraits, but I also use it throughout other parts of the wedding day as well, such as speeches and reception lighting. So it's important to me that I do use off-camera flash and that I use a camera which enables me to do that. Now, to be fair, I haven't used the A9 very much when it comes to off-camera flash as yet. Of the weddings which I've photographed, it's only been the last 3 or 4 where I've really tried to use off-camera flash. And again, to be fair, it works. The great thing about the A9 in particular is that I can use my existing triggers, my Photic Strato triggers, and they work seamlessly. So I can use the same speed lights, the same receivers as I have been using for the past 2 or 3 years with my Nikon cameras with the A9, and it just works, and that's been brilliant. The downside really is that the camera just doesn't feel as though it's intuitively made for off-camera flash. And an illustration of that is that to use off-camera flash with the A9, I have to go into the menu system and make 2 changes. One is I have to turn off the electronic shutter and use the mechanical shutter, and that means that I can't use silent shooting anymore with off-camera flash. And the other is that I have to turn off the live setting of the EVF. I have to turn off the live display, as otherwise when I'm using off-camera flash and underexposing all the ambient, the screen would just be dark and I wouldn't see what I was shooting. So I haven't got an issue with that as such. It's more that I just have to go into the menu system and make those 2 changes. That can be sped up by using the custom buttons, but still the fact is that I have to go into a menu system and change 2 settings in order to use off-camera flash. So it's just a little bit faffy, and it's just not a seamless process if you want to go from shooting natural light to off-camera flash. So not a huge problem, but something that is a bit of a shame. So that's been the most obvious disadvantage which I've found. And the second disadvantage is more of an obvious one, I suppose, and that's just the cost. Moving from one system to another is always going to be expensive, but the Sony A9 in particular is not a cheap camera. It's quite an expensive camera, and for me, I always want to use 2 cameras at the same time. Buying 2 bodies alone, 2 A9 bodies alone, is extremely expensive, running into the thousands, and that's before you even think about buying new lenses. At the moment, I own 3 Sony lenses. I'm going to be adding a 4th, and then that will be it for lenses. But the whole cost of moving is pretty eye-watering. Having said that, I think it's, pardon the pun, a relatively small price to pay for the advantages, but it's something that you really need to consider when it comes to moving systems. You really need to balance out whether the advantages of using mirrorless cameras are going to outweigh the cost for you, and that will be different for everyone. It all depends on how you use your camera and the style of photography which you do, and it's not a cheap process at all, so it's something to really consider before you do make the move. Now the third downside is something which I found a particular struggle at the beginning when I first bought the camera, and that's using the actual files in post-processing. So I've been used to using Nikon RAW files now since I first started, which is say 12 years. I've really got to grips with what I can do with those files, how I can use them, and I've developed presets which work particularly well, I feel, with my Nikon RAW files. Now when you move camera systems, obviously the raw files that you're getting out of that camera are going to be different. They're going to have a different color profile, and it's going to take you a little bit of time to adapt to how those files handle. So for example, the preset which I've used now, which I developed for my Nikon files, don't work with the Sony files, which is to be expected. The color profile is very different with the Sony camera, so it's taken me a while to develop a preset which I feel works well for my style with the Sony cameras. So that's been one thing, which is just developing the new preset. But as well, I also feel as though the Sony A9 files don't have as much dynamic range as my Nikon RAW files did. My style of photography was to shoot slightly underexposed, knowing that I could bring back lots of shadow detail. Now, when I first started using the A9, that's how I was shooting. I was shooting purposely underexposed, assuming that I could bring back the same amount of detail from the shadows, and I found that not to be the case. So with the Sony files, if I do try and bring back the shadow details, I find that can result in quite noisy and grainier images than I was used to. So to compensate for that, I have to now get my exposures better in camera, which is fine, and that's easy to do with the A9 due to the EVF, as I mentioned earlier. But it's something that again has taken a little bit of time to get used to, and it is a shame that I can't bring back as much detail from the shadows as I would ideally like to, and that I've been used to. So that's been something that has been a struggle. I say I'm getting more used to it now, but I think it's worth noting as being a downside, especially if you are coming from Nikon as I was, because I think Nikon cameras are exceptional when it comes to shooting in low light, and in particular bringing back shadow detail. I don't think that the Sony A9 has the same dynamic range in its RAW files as my Nikon D810 files did, so that has been a bit of a shame. So overall, they're the three disadvantages which I've found using off-camera flash, although I say there are workarounds. Cost, eye-watering, and the dynamic range of the files and just getting used to the files. They've been the three things which have really sort of been a downside to me. None of them are deal breakers, but they're certainly worth noting, I feel. So in conclusion, would I recommend the Sony A9 to other wedding photographers? Without a doubt. It has been absolutely amazing. I've loved the experience of using mirrorless, and in particular the advantages of the A9 have just been amazing for me. When it comes to shooting documentary wedding photography in natural light, then the A9 I think is almost perfect. It's been absolutely incredible, and I feel as though I've improved as a photographer for using the A9, and that in itself has made it worthwhile for me. I say there are downsides, and they are a shame, but once you get over the cost of moving, which I say is it takes me a while and I'm still getting over that, but once you get over that cost, and once you get used to using the files and just working around the off-camera flash issues, then there is nothing really to worry about when it comes to the move. And the upsides, in my opinion, far outweigh the downsides. So if you're on the fence about it, I would massively encourage you to at least try and maybe just borrow an A9, hire one, or an A7 III if the silent shooting isn't as big an issue for you as it is for me. And just have a play around, because I feel as though if you've been used to using DSLRs, I would be extremely surprised if you didn't love the camera almost instantly. I do feel as though this is the way that camera technology is going, and within 2 or 3 years virtually everyone will have moved to mirrorless, or if they haven't, then they will certainly be about to. To me now, using the DSLR just feels old-fashioned. They do feel clunky, just slow, big, heavy, you know, all the things that you don't really want to associate with cameras really. The A9, it just feels like a younger, fresher, cooler, lighter camera, and it feels like the future. So there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have any questions at all, and I'm sure that there are lots of questions that people may have about a topic like this, then please do put them in the comment section and I'll do my best to answer them. I love receiving comments and I try to reply to every single one. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.